Greetings, friends. My name's Elias Sacks, and I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society. As you may know, in October 2023, we released the JPS TANAKH Gender Sensitive Edition. This is the first major update of our translation of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, in nearly 4 decades. It was released in partnership with the online library Sepharia, and it elicited praise, gratitude, and many questions. What is this translation? What does gender sensitive mean? Is this somehow the woke Bible? Is it faithful to the Bible's Hebrew? So I explore many of these questions in another video available on our site entitled the JPS Gender Sensitive Tanakh Translation, a 15-minute tour. You can find a link in the comments below or by visiting jps.org. And so in this video instead, I want to explore a different set of questions. What other changes do we make in this translation beyond changes relating to gender? What are the other ways in which we update our iconic English rendering of the Tanakh? What other steps do we take to ensure that the timeless teachings of the Hebrew Bible are accessible to 21st century readers? So to answer these questions, let me first remind you what our new translation is. As I share in more depth in that other video, the single most important thing to know about this new translation is that it's precisely that, a new translation. It doesn't touch the Bible's Hebrew. Instead, it asks how that Hebrew should be rendered into English in a way that's historically rigorous and religiously meaningful. So some of you may know the landmark 1985 JPS Tanakh translation, which is often seen as the gold standard English Bible translation. You may know it with this blue cover or in this Hebrew English edition. That's often referred to as the new JPS translation or NJPS because it replaced an earlier JPS translation from 1917. Unlike all JPS Tanakh translations, it's driven by a dual commitment to historical accuracy and religious musicality. It draws on academic Bible scholarship and on Jewish religious learning to present a translation that's faithful to the Hebrew, that captures what the Bible meant in its original context, and that does all of this in a manner that resonates with contemporary readers. Now, it's also these same commitments that animate our updated 2023 translation. This edition revisits the 1985 English version with a focus on the terminology it uses for God and human beings. More specifically, this new 2023 translation goes through the Tanakh word by word, line by line, verse by verse, and asks when gender-inclusive renderings are appropriate and when gendered language is called for historically and linguistically. For example, it asks whether a term for a human being should be translated as person or as man. It asks whether a reference to God should be translated with gender-neutral language, say as God, or with a male-sounding term such as kit. This updated translation then is a revision of our 1985 version, and we're abbreviating it as RJPS, or the Revised JPS translation. It revisits and revises and renews the 1985 English edition with a focus on fidelity to the Bible's Hebrew, on fidelity to the Bible's context, and on fidelity to contemporary life, and what all of this means for how the gender of God and human beings are handled in English. But this is not the only issue that we take up, right? This is not the only type of revision we make. Rather, we've also recognized that our commitment to opening up the Bible in a historically accurate and religiously meaningful way requires other sorts of revisions. With that in mind, I want to offer just a few examples. So first of all, in our JPS, we replace all sorts of archaic English terminology that appeared in NJPS, such as beseech and bewail, with more contemporary terminology. We want the Bible to be intelligible to today's readers. And that means that some English word choices, which might have worked for readers in 1985, no longer work for readers today, right? Terms that all or most readers might have understood in 1985 might be understood by only a smaller portion of readers today. Terms that might have sounded natural or unremarkable in 1985 might now sound stilted or disconcerting. The Bible's Hebrew remains inviolate, but the specific English words needed to convey that Hebrew might change a great deal over 4 decades. Second, we've added many new explanatory notes at the bottom of our pages seeking to clarify features of the biblical text. You can see what this looks like here. This is a page of our JPS, and you can see the notes appearing at the bottom. Now, sometimes there's wordplay at work in the Bible's Hebrew that might not be immediately visible to English readers, and we have notes to highlight and explain that wordplay. Sometimes there are alternate translations that we considered but rejected. We have notes that identify some of those cases. Sometimes there are ambiguities in the Hebrew text of the Bible, say about whether it's God or an angel who's speaking to a given person or group, or about whether it's the entire Israelite community or just a smaller subset of that group being addressed by God in a particular moment. And we have notes that try to identify some of those ambiguities and possibilities and different interpretations. Some of these notes were already present in NJPS in the 1985 translation, but many, many new ones have been added. Finally, and perhaps most strikingly, we've revised our approach to translating one key set of terms in the Bible, terms relating to certain aspects of biblical ritual practice. Perhaps the most important example includes the Hebrew terms tameh and tahor, which NJPS translated as unclean and clean. The problem with those translations, the problem with rendering these Hebrew terms as unclean and clean, is that they can conjure up images of hygiene and dirt, as if something that's tameh is simply kind of covered in schmutz, right? Thereby, and this runs the risk of obscuring what for many scholars is really at stake here, which has to do less with kind of hygiene and dirt and more to do with ritual purity, with questions involving an individual's status and ability to engage with the deity at a particular moment in time. So rather than translate tameh and tahor as unclean and clean, then we now translate them as impure and pure. One good example comes from the laws of kashrut, from biblical dietary laws in Leviticus 11, which NJPS translates as follows. This is in the 1985 translation. There are creatures that you may eat from among all the land animals. Any animal that has two hooves with clefts through the hooves and that chews the cud, such you may eat. The following, however, of those that either chew the cud or have true hooves, you shall not eat. The camel, although it chews the cud, it has no true hooves. It is unclean for you. The daman, although it chews the cud, it has no true hooves. It is unclean for you. The hare, although it chews the cud, it has no true hooves. It's unclean for you. And the swine, although it has true hooves, with the hooves cleft through, it does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. And the following shall make you unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be unclean until evening, and whoever carries the carcasses of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Right, the impression here with all these references to uncleanliness, the impression here is of a concern with hygiene, right? As if what's simply at stake with these animals is an issue of whether they're hygienic or not, whether they're clean or not. And so to avoid that kind of implication, to avoid that sort of connotation, our JPS revises this language to now talk about purity and impurity, to translate these terms as referring to the purity status of these animals and of the people who come into contact with them. We see something similar in the next chapter of Leviticus, where NJPS, the 1985 translation, offers the following rendering of a key biblical passage on childbirth. Speak to the Israelite people thus: when a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean at the time of her menstrual infirmity. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. If she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. So as you can see, we've revised this in our JPS to offer a reference not to uncleanliness, but rather to purity, right? A rendering focused not on kind of hygiene at the time following childbirth, but on the ritual status of the person who gives birth, right? For the Bible, this moment, it's not that giving birth makes you dirty. Rather, it's that giving birth inaugurates a process involving one's relationship with the divine. There are many other examples we could give. For example, there are other sorts of ritual terms that we also revise, such as terms relating to certain sorts of sacrifices. And there are other changes we make as well, correcting typos in NJPS, for example, or addressing moments where translation in NJPS had some unintentional ambiguities. And you can read all about this in the preface to our new translation. And of course, we want to make sure that you can get access to this. You can see here links to learn more and special discount codes to use to get versions of this text. For now, though, again, I want to thank all of you for thinking with me right now and for joining with me to explore the different kinds of steps that this translation has taken to ensure that the Bible and its timeless lessons continue to speak in today's world.